Now he says that they visited Nigeria and said that they would give them $50 million across the board in cash with no repayment if they would be willing to double the price of light oil. Basic explanation is following. Only 2 nations in the world have light crude. Light crude oil is an oil that as it comes out of the ground, it could almost be used in your automobile. It's the most valuable oil in the world. And according to the price of light crude, all other oil in the world is priced in accordance with the way those 2 nations price light crude. Whoever controls the price of light crude oil likewise controls all the oil prices in the world. Therefore, he said, they went to Nigeria, one of the 2 nations that has light crude, said, we'll give you this money if you will double the price of light crude. Now, the Arabs come into picture.
At the same time, Bush and some others, the Tri-National Commission, were in the Middle East, persuading the Middle East nations and England to consolidate OPEC, of which, of course, America is also a part, but never mentioned. The deal cut with the Middle Eastern oil producers was that the oil buyers were prepared to pay significantly higher prices for the oil, provided the Middle Eastern nations supported America, this is how it was put, by investing the revenues in the big banks in America.
Arabs, who today are sheikhs and sheiks, 30 to 40 years ago were nomads roaming the deserts riding camels. The international bankers found out that there was oil in their countries. They went and persuaded them to allow them to produce that oil by financing their oil fields. After they had financed their oil fields, they charged them usury for building their oil supply systems and their refineries. After the usury had been repaid because the Arabs became rich so quickly, back in those days you were paying at the gas pump 30 cents per gallon for gasoline. First of all, the international bankers went to Nigeria, doubled the price of light crude. Then, unbeknownst to the Arabs, who had become wealthy overnight, knew nothing about international finance, had just been riding their camels out in the desert a few years ago, now they go to them and say, we will take the price of crude oil to any place you want it to go, as high as you would like it to go, if you will take a portion of the funds that you get from this new price rise that we're going to give you and deposit it in the international bankers' banks in New York. And you must deposit it in 30-year time certificates. Are you beginning to see now why 71, 72, 73, and 74 that prices of oil skyrocketed? It was because the international bankers, who have the purse strings of the world, knew that the increase in the price of oil that was going to the Arabs would come right back to their banks as 30-year time certificate deposits. Now, watch what they intended to do with those 30-year time certificate deposits, and you begin to get a picture of what's happening.
Sheikh Imani's nephew assured us that Sheikh Imani and the other oil ministers did not know until late in the 70s, early in the 80s, that the controlling interests of the prime banks were also the same people who had the controlling interests of the major oil companies.
The sheikhs of that day and time did not understand world finance. They did not know that the international bankers were taking them, and neither did they understand that America's major oil companies, such as Standard Oil, Atlantic Richfield, and the other major oil companies, were likewise controlled by the money of the international bankers' banks in New York. Therefore, the total picture of intake of profit on the part of the international bankers was all coming back to them. These Arabs, not understanding any of this international finance, fell for the plot of the international bankers, and little by little the story becomes more bizarre.
Actually, through a joint stock trust that was set up by the original Rockefeller here in America in 1870, 3 years before the U.S. government declared joint stock trusts illegal in 1873. It is that entity that is the ultimate controlling factor in America of the prime banks, of the Federal Reserve Board.
There was a joint stock trust. They're no longer legal in America, but they were set up in the 1800s, and it's under those joint stock trusts that the international bankers' banks in New York are allowed to operate, which other banks in America are not allowed to operate under. Do you wonder why the Chase Manhattan Chemical Bank, J.P. Morgan's Bank, and the others in New York are showing all-time record earnings, while around America, literally hundreds of banks per month are going broke? The reason is because they are operating under a grandfather clause of a joint bank trust, which is no longer legal, but because of the grandfather clause, they can operate in New York, that section of banks, and in so doing, take these finances and be able to manipulate with them both us and the Arabs. And with this, he continues,
the major oil companies and many of the major multinationals. That trust is in joint control of the Rockefeller Foundation and the European interests.
Bank trust controls both the Rockefeller Foundation, controls the Federal Reserve, and it's the method whereby they were able to gain control of the currency of the United States of America back in 1913 through the Federal Reserve, which no one else can do because those trusts are no longer allowed.
The deal cut with the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the Middle Eastern people was that they should put their money in the prime banks. They did not know that the prime banks were able to lend 20 to 1, I think it is in this country, but maybe more now, but their revenues, all they were receiving was the interest on the money they deposited.
Now, the Arabs did not realize that fractional reserve banking could be practiced by these banks. They did not understand banking. Remember, they had just been nomads on the deserts not too long ago. But through this, the international bankers were able to gain the control of the money of the Arab world, and the Arab world only received back the interest off of the money that they had put into the international bankers' banks under these 30-year time deposits.
Between 10 and 30 years, receiving the principal at the end of the term. Because they had locked-in deposits, the banks were then able to make loans to the third world nations.
Now, through the funds that they had gained from the Arabs, which was directly related to the increase of oil prices, through a manipulation that had been made with the Arab world, and taking the price of your gasoline from 30 cents a gallon to $1.20 a gallon, now with this money coming back into the international bankers' banks, they take those funds, which originally came from you and from me, and invested them in the third world countries. You do remember, 15, 20 years ago, when the international bankers started investing in third world country loans. The countries that are going broke today, they invested back then. But they wanted those countries to go broke, and here is that part of the story.
Knowing and relying on the greed of the ministers of these nations to mishandle the money over the years to the extent where that manipulated greed has caused those countries to be in the position they're in.
They wanted those third world countries to go broke. You'll remember about the time that most of the third world countries were getting their independence. Independence from England, independence from France, independence from America, and they were setting up their own governments. Now, he said at that point the international bankers loaned them these large sums of money which had come to them through the Arabs as a result of their oil prices. At this point, the international bankers wanted the third world countries to misuse those funds. They intended for them to go broke. It was part of the plan for those third world countries to squander the funds. Remember that the new leaders of these countries themselves had never governed any country before. They knew very little even about government. They had only been colonial countries under some other country. So the international bankers knew that their leaders would squander the money that was being given to them, which international bankers had taken from the Arabs and just from you originally through oil prices, and now here is where it goes.
In 1981, I was exposed to trying to help the Hunt brothers in Texas because they, with John Connolly, who was then the governor of Texas, who was also then the Undersecretary of the Treasury, had secretly tried to implement a currency, a new currency for Texas, since Texas is only a part of the Union, by treaty, which is automatically renewed every year, but not necessarily automatically renewed every year. It's become a tradition, obviously, that it's renewed every year, but it's actually not renewed every year.
Did you know that Texas is not a state by vote, such as other states, but a state by treaty? I see one head shaking here on the front. Texas is a state by treaty, not by vote. Now, you must know that Texas at one time became very wealthy and independent individuals, such as the Hunt brothers, who years ago were nothing, but they were made rich overnight through the wealth of oil in Texas when oil was first struck and became so popular in the early days. Texas being the place where the Hunt brothers lived, and John Connolly being the governor of Texas at one time, and you remember was in the limousine with John F. Kennedy when he was shot, and they tried to shoot Connolly also, but he went down the floorboard of the vehicle and lived through it to tell it. Well, there's a story behind why John Connolly was attempted to be assassinated, and while the Hunt brothers today are bankrupt, men that were multi-billionaires 15 years ago, were some of the wealthiest men in the world, the Hunt brothers. And today, I was just in Dallas, Texas a few weeks ago, my wife and I, and an individual who was a friend of ours met with the Hunt brothers. They are in court right now in the process of attempting to stall off financial bankruptcy. They have been bankrupted by the internationalists. And the reason that the Hunt brothers are being broken today is because the internationalists knew what the Hunt brothers and Connolly, former governor of Texas, were trying to do. Texas being a state by treaty, not by vote, anytime that Texas wishes to, they cannot renew their treaty for that year and could legally secede from the Union. And the Hunt brothers and John Connolly knew that Texas had the ability of setting up their own country, having their own currency, and being solvent and not under the dictates of the Federal Reserve or the bureaucracy in Washington, and they were in the process of gaining a corner on the silver of the world in order to be able to finance a process whereby they could overcome the international bankers. And at that point, the Hunt brothers were broken. John Connolly was almost killed, and Texas, who could have been the only state in the Union to fulfill it, had some major problems. And today, Dallas and Fort Worth, Texas, you ride through the cities and you would vow and declare that it was almost a ghost town in certain areas. Storefronts are closed. People have moved out of $150,000, $200,000 homes. The internationalists became so angry at what Texas had done until they broke the back of the oil industry and the major oil producers of Texas, and it was all by a design plan. And we go further.
And the intention was that Texas was going to create its own money. The Hunts were in partnership with the Shah of Iran, a German banker and an Austrian banker. The Federal Reserve Board got to hear about it. The Hunts were buying silver irresponsibly because they had one man doing both buying and selling on the same floors of all the exchanges, and word got out. And the result of that was that the German banker was murdered. You may remember the Bader-Meinhof terrorists at the time, who only actually ever murdered one person, although a lot of industrialists were captured and held to ransom and various other things. Only one actually man, which was the banker, ever got murdered, and it was that banker that was the partners of the Hunts.
Hunt brothers of Texas and a banker were attempting to do this. He said that one was killed, the Shah of Iran was deposed, and the Hunt brothers today are filing for bankruptcy. You see what the internationalists can do whenever you attempt to thwart their plan.